So I'm going to read an essay that was in this anthology, 44 on 44, that collects the ideas and thoughts of African American writers about the election of Barack Obama. And when I first heard about the book, I didn't know how to write about it without, it being cliched or very sentimental. And so I thought about a little boy who was in my neighborhood who really identified with Obama. And I'd been wanting to write about this kid for a while because he'd been marginalized in our community for reasons that had to do with ethnicity. And so that's what I'm going to read. Go be a superhero. I have not seen Muhammad for over a year, but suddenly he is here running alongside the car that I drive, pumping one celebratory fist into the air. He's shouting praises in response to my Barack Obama bumper sticker. He runs so close to my car that I get nervous and pull over to the curb. He is slimmer than I remember, with longer hair and thicker eyelashes. Although his cheekbones have sharpened and his voice is in a lower register, he is still not mature. He looks androgynous in the way of 11-year-old boys. I sense the man that he will become, though. He lurks like pond life just behind the boyish eyes. Where have you been? I ask him. I've been around. At school, mostly, he says. I go to Bogle now, just up the street. When I first met Muhammad, he was a chubby 9-year-old who had moved into our neighborhood with his mom. He attended a Phoenix charter school that specialized in science and technology. Muhammad was 3 years older than my son. Our houses sat at a diagonal across a typical East Valley street. We had the basketball hoop. He had the swimming pool. Both houses had trampolines. Muhammad and my son had this in common as well. Both boys were unequivocal geeks. They collected comic books. They both liked archaeology and science experiments that involved insects. They loved video games, and they went through game systems as fast as the technology advanced. Many days they would sit in my living room, their backs hunched over electronic devices, trying to muster the concentration that it took to get to the next level. They'd have discussions bordering on dissertations about the attributes of Bakugan and Pokemon characters. I liked Muhammad in all of his geeky glory. I also appreciated that he was well-mannered, even though that was no longer in style. He said, "Yes, ma'am," "No, ma'am," "Please," and "Thank you." When he saw me with groceries, he'd help me carry the bags inside, while the other neighborhood boys stood around in the street. In the universe of kids, however, having manners holds zero cachet. Bless you. Muhammad had problems fitting in. His problems may have had something to do with his nerdiness or his weight, but over time I became convinced that it was related to his ethnicity, religion, and to class distinctions. No one wants to be the exotic kid, but that's exactly how people viewed Muhammad. At a time when Muslims were portrayed in the media as dark-skinned terrorists, here was a Muslim boy, named after the Islamic prophet, who looked white and whose mother was white. Muhammad's father, who was Middle Eastern, was not around. It did not help either that Muhammad's mother embraced a working-class ethos that was at odds with the self-indulgent values of suburbia. She worked and went to school, which meant that she was tired by the time she returned home. When Muhammad's mother was napping or doing homework, she didn't allow kids to play at her house. She did not hire a landscaper like many of our neighbors. Instead, Muhammad cut their grass. She drove an old car that had out-of-state license plates and that lacked air conditioning. And because changing your family schedule is hard as a single parent, she kept Muhammad enrolled at the science school for a year, which didn't help him make friends where he now lived. Muhammad's problems became clear to me one evening in 2006 when a neighbor appeared unannounced at my door. It was right before sunset, and the sky was in a dramatic flux, the horizon streaked with oranges, blues, pinks, violets. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" the neighbor whispered through the screen. "Come on in," I said. We stood on the small tiled floor at the entrance to my house. "Is your kid going to Muhammad's sleepover?" she asked, still whispering. I decided to lower my voice too. We were discussing the very serious matter of sleepovers. Yes, I whispered, my kid's spending the night at Muhammad's. She told me that a car on our street had been vandalized overnight and that someone said 9-year-old Muhammad was responsible. At first, I thought it was a joke, but then she repeated rumors that my son had shared with me. People were saying Muhammad was a bully, that he used dirty language. Muhammad's older brother was supposedly in juvenile detention. I stood for a minute in shocked silence. If people were saying this about Muhammad, what were they saying about my black family? I told the neighbor what I told my son, to base her opinions on her personal experiences with the boy. She ended up sending her son to Muhammad's party, but he was not allowed to spend the night. I witnessed small cruelties performed at Muhammad's expense. A few kids would run and hide when Muhammad came outside. Muhammad kept coming around believing that this was a game and he was just being asked to chase them. They upped the ante. They began telling him straight up that their parents forbid them to play with him. For weeks, Muhammad still went to their homes. He knew other boys were gathered inside. The parents would tell him that there were too many kids in the house. Sometimes they did not answer the door. After a while, I stopped seeing Muhammad outside. He played at our house and at a couple other houses, but not as often. The next time I saw him, it was spring 2008, and he was running alongside my car. He talked to me for half an hour that day about Barack Obama's candidacy. Did I know that Obama's father had been Muslim and that Obama would end the war and save the environment? He was excited as he rattled off political facts, and he spoke with a sense of purpose. He also gushed with the nerd speak that I loved. Have you seen the t-shirt with Obama in the Superman suit where he's holding the flag on the White House lawn? He asked. Before that day, I cringed at the iconography that portrayed Obama as a pop culture product or superhero. Those images were everywhere, on posters, t-shirts, comic books. The images seemed too simple. They were a reductive representation of a thoughtful and complex man. But then I watched Muhammad, whose struggle with identity was so similar to Obama's, respond in a positive way to that iconography. Obama as superhero spoke to Muhammad in a language that was familiar. Muhammad had been marginalized in our community for reasons that maybe he did not fully understand. But as a fanboy, he understood the narrative arc of a superhero. He immediately recognized Obama as someone who could overcome the odds, and that was enough identification for him to hook his young fate to. The Halloween before the election, our streets were crammed with revelers. My son, who was then 8, dressed somewhat predictably as a ninja in all black. It was a better costume than the year before, when his too small Spider-Man outfit looked like he dressed in bright blue spandex pedal pushers. Muhammad, on the other hand, chose a more sophisticated costume. He wore a John McCain mask and an Obama campaign t-shirt. I read his costume as saying, "Even John McCain is a Barack Obama supporter." It was a funny and subversive message like something you would see on South Park. "A vote for McCain is a vote for the same," Muhammad squawked from behind his mask. To the consternation of some parents, he said this all night, instead of trick or treat. On the day that Obama was elected as the 44th President of the United States, I arrived at my polling place around 6:30 in the morning. Already 100 people stood in line. Muhammad, who had just turned 12, stood next to his mom in the middle of the line. He wore an Obama sticker affixed to his t-shirt. When he saw me, he grinned and waved. Although he was too young to vote, he did not look out of place. In fact, he looked like he had figured everything out. I'm so sorry. Okay. So our next reader is Aisha Sloan. Aisha earned an MA in Cultural Studies and Studio Art from New York University and an MFA in Creative Nonfiction from the University of Arizona. Her writing has appeared in various journals such as IdentityTheory.com, Terrain.org, Callaloo, Michigan Quarterly Review, and elsewhere. She currently teaches writing at the University of Arizona. Please welcome Aisha.
I just have to say I'm really excited about this night. It's been kind of a tonic emotionally after all these weeks of, this sort of political nonsense, and it's tough teaching race to freshmen at the U of A. One thing I wanted to say as a preface here is I read Eulibis's essay, All Apologies, a couple of years ago, and was very surprised at how important it was that at the end of the essay she apologized for slavery as a Caucasian person. And I think one of the things we forget when there's so many people to blame for the way that society is to own up to our own responsibility and creating the environment that we live in, even if we aren't as bad as some other people. But of course, there are those horrible things that all of us, unfortunately, could probably reveal and apologize for. So this seemed relevant to that way of going about this discussion. So this is part of a longer essay about Paris. For the longest time, I tried to remember how her face looked when a woman told me this story about herself. Ashamed because the only ones she knew were in German, my mother never sang me lullabies. Coming of age in Paris after World War II, her mother's heritage was a constant source of humiliation. As it turns out, I could never remember the way she told this story because this interaction never happened. In our conversations, she was always cheerful, gracious, optimistic. I did not fabricate this story, though. I see from my journal that this was the first thing that the person who'd introduced us had thought to mention about this woman. Perhaps because it lies off to the side of her preferred narrative, outside of the image she's chosen to represent her life, I picture this lack of song in her childhood like a back street of loneliness that she must periodically wander down, a space for her loss and her mother's muted shame to inhabit. Like a dream I once had of losing my mother in a health food store, I ran down a busy Los Angeles street, chasing after her dark purple nightgown. Unlike the young city, Los Angeles, where I grew up, Paris is too old to deny these kinds of crevices, cobblestones woven with guilt, puddles that reflect a history of human cruelty, such as, when I was a child, without knowing the meaning of what I was doing, I taunted a Jewish schoolmate named Joshua by hissing the word Hitler at him. We'd been told that he would spit every time we said this name. He didn't just spit, though. He crouched down toward the pavement and covered his ears. One summer in Paris, I stepped off of a train and walked through Gare Saint-Lazare. I wandered into an exhibition of photographs taken of children who had been deported to concentration camps during World War II. A small woman asked, "Do you recognize anyone?" Past acts of violence and never heard lullabies echo off of this question and play like a busker's tune in the subway station terminal of my memory. I wrote down the story of a little boy named Bernard Jubus, who couldn't pronounce his last name. Misrepresented in the ledgers as Bernard Jubes, his true identity fell into a space that for years, history, such a huge word, could not account for. I don't remember his face. Susan Sontag points out that that photographs are often used as memento mori, reminders of mortality, and of the capacity within human beings to inflict violence upon each other. She refers to the protagonist in Ingmar Bergman's film Persona, who carried with her the image of the small Jewish boy, quote, photographed in 1943, during the roundup in the Warsaw Ghetto, his arms raised, solemn with terror, end quote. I tried to repent in small ways for how I'd treated Joshua. I crossed Hitler's name out every time I wrote it in history class, which became so habitual I didn't stop until I got to college. But we cannot swallow these words any more than we can erase the horrors they evoke. In a novel that takes place in Greece during the Holocaust, Fugitive Pieces, Anne Michaels writes, "If sound waves carry on to infinity, where are their screams now? I imagine them somewhere in the galaxy moving forever toward the Psalms." In 1900 or 1901, Eugene Atgay took a photograph of Rue Concomptois. Some shadow of awareness of this image or one like it must have been inside of me when, 98 years later, I raised the lens on a similar street with just the same slickness from rain and a similar slice of sunlight falling through a narrow gap between the buildings. Thank you.